They began to notice the quiet in him before they ever understood it. At first, it was small, almost unimportant. A pause where there used to be a quick reply, a silence where there might have been laughter. They thought little of it. People change, they said. Moods come and go. But the quiet did not leave. It stayed with him, like a shadow that moved gently beside him. It followed him into every moment, soft and steady. And the more it stayed, the more they began to wonder. Why had he grown so still? They watched him carefully, though they never said it out loud. They listened for the words he no longer offered. They waited for reactions that never came. And in that waiting, they began to fill the silence with their own meanings. They thought something in him had broken. Perhaps they believed he had grown tired, or weak, or distant, in a way that could not be repaired. It is easy, after all, to mistake silence for emptiness. Easy to assume that when a person says less, they feel less. But silence does not always mean absence. Sometimes it is where everything begins. Inside him, something was changing in a way that could not be seen from the outside. It was not loud. It did not announce itself. There were no sudden moments that could be pointed to and named. It was quieter than that. It was the slow pulling back of words that no longer felt right. The gentle noticing of how often he had spoken without being heard, how often he had explained himself, only to be misunderstood, and so, little by little, he stopped. Not all at once, not in anger, just less explaining, less defending, less reaching outward in search of something that never quite met him halfway. Have you ever felt that? That quiet moment when you begin to wonder if your words are being carried away before they even land. He felt it often, and each time something inside him softened and withdrew. Just a little more. They saw the withdrawal, but not the reason. They saw the silence, but not the awareness behind it. And so they began to speak around him, as if he were slowly fading from the space he once filled. But he was not fading. He was becoming more aware of the space itself. He began to notice things he had never truly seen before. The way words could be used without care. The way reactions could pull him into places he never wished to go. The way giving too much of himself left him feeling quietly empty. And in those moments of noticing, his silence deepened. Not as a shield, not yet, but as a kind of listening. A listening not to others, but to something within him that had been drowned out for a long time. It was unfamiliar at first. This stillness, this absence of immediate response, it felt almost like standing in a room where all the noise had suddenly stopped, and realizing you had forgotten what true quiet sounded like. There was discomfort in it, a gentle unease, because silence, when it first arrives, can feel like loss of connection, loss of certainty, loss of the familiar rhythm of speaking and being spoken to. But beneath that discomfort, there was something else, something quieter, but steadier. A sense that not all silence is empty. Some silence holds, some silence protects, and some silence begins to rebuild. They could not see this, They only saw what was missing. They did not see what was forming. And so they mistook his quiet for weakness. They mistook his stillness for surrender. But deep within him, something was slowly, patiently gathering, not in noise, not in force, but in silence that did not ask to be understood. At times, the quiet felt heavier than he expected. There were moments when the urge to speak rose up suddenly, almost like a reflex he had known his whole life. Words would gather at the edge of his lips, ready to step forward, ready to defend, to explain, to make things clear again. And for a brief second, it felt easier to give in, to return to what was familiar, to answer, to react, to meet every misunderstanding with another attempt to be understood. But something held him back, not forcefully, not like a wall, more like a gentle hand resting on his shoulder, asking him to wait just a little longer. So he paused. And in that pause, he began to notice something he had never truly seen before. Not every word needed to be spoken. Not every moment required his voice. They continued as they always had. Their words moved quickly, sometimes without care, sometimes without listening. They spoke as if silence was something to be filled, as if stillness was something to be corrected. And when he did not respond, they noticed. At first, they tried to draw him back. Small remarks, quiet questions, a tone that hinted at confusion more than concern. Why so quiet? Is something wrong? He heard them, of course he did. But answering those questions felt different now. It felt like stepping back into a pattern he was slowly beginning to understand and quietly step away from. So again, he chose not to answer right away, not out of coldness, not out of distance, but out of something he could not fully explain. Have you ever felt that moment? When you know that speaking would only lead you in circles, back to the same place, with the same weight. He began to recognize that feeling more clearly with each passing day. It was not that he had nothing to say. It was that saying it would change nothing. And so his silence deepened, not as an absence, but as a choice. Still, they misunderstood. They began to create their own reasons for his quiet. Some thought he had grown distant. Others believed he no longer cared. A few assumed he was simply lost in himself, unable to reach outward the way he once had. They filled the space he left behind with their own conclusions. And none of them were true. But he did not rush to correct them. That was new. There had been a time when being misunderstood felt unbearable, when he would search for the right words, the perfect tone, the clearest explanation, just to bring things back into balance. Now, he let it remain unbalanced, not because he enjoyed it, but because he was beginning to understand something deeper. Understanding could not be forced, no matter how carefully he spoke, no matter how gently he explained. If they were not truly listening, his words would only pass through them, like wind through an open field. So why chase something that would not stay? This realization did not come all at once. It came in small, quiet moments. Moments when he almost spoke, and then didn't. Moments when he listened instead, not to respond but simply to hear, and in that listening, he began to notice the weight of words more clearly, how easily they could be misplaced, how quickly they could be turned into something else. And slowly, almost without realizing it, he began to respect his own silence, not as something to hide behind, but as something to hold. There was a quiet strength in not rushing to fill every gap, a quiet clarity in allowing things to remain as they were, without stepping in to reshape them. They still spoke, they still questioned, they still tried, in their own ways, to pull him back into the noise he once lived in. But he no longer followed so easily. Instead, he stayed where he was, in that still, quiet space he was only just beginning to understand. And though it felt unfamiliar, though it sometimes felt lonely, there was also something else growing there. Something steady, something patient, something that did not need to be proven or explained or even seen, only felt. And for the first time, he allowed that feeling to remain. Without interruption, there came a moment, so small it could have been missed. Nothing around him changed. The voices were the same. The patterns were the same. Even the tension in the air felt familiar, like something he had walked through many times before. But something within him was different. They spoke, as they always did. Words layered with assumption, with certainty, with a quiet expectation that he would answer, that he would step forward and take his place in the exchange. And for a brief second, he almost did. The habit was still there, resting just beneath the surface, that old pull to explain himself, to soften the moment, to make things smoother, easier, more acceptable. He felt it rise, a familiar warmth in his chest, a readiness in his breath, the beginning of a response forming without effort. But then he paused. Not long, just enough. And in that pause, something became clear in a way it never had before. He saw the moment for what it was. Not a question that needed an answer, not a situation that required his voice, but a pattern repeating itself, asking him to step back into a role he had quietly begun to leave behind. It was subtle. There was no force, no demand, only an expectation, soft, unspoken, but present. And for the first time, he did not move toward it. He stayed where he was. The words that had gathered within him, they did not disappear. They remained, waiting. But he no longer felt the same urgency to release them. Have you ever felt that shift when the need to respond fades, even though the words are still there? It is a strange feeling. Not silence forced upon you, but silence chosen. He let the moment pass. They waited at first, a second longer than usual, a quiet space where his voice would have once filled the air. And when it didn't, something changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a slight shift in their tone, their posture, their attention, as if the absence of his response had gently unsettled something they had always assumed would be there. They moved on. The moment closed without him, and yet he remained. There was no regret, no sudden rush to correct himself, to go back and say what he had held back, no feeling that he had lost something by staying silent. Instead, There was a quiet steadiness, a sense that something had been kept rather than given away. It was unfamiliar, but not uncomfortable. In fact, it felt right. He began to understand then, not through words, but through feeling, that not every moment deserved his energy. Not every misunderstanding needed to be resolved. Not every expectation needed to be met. And more importantly, not every silence needed to be broken. This realization did not make him distant. It made him clear. Clear in a way that did not depend on others seeing it. Clear in a way that did not require agreement or acknowledgement. Just clear within himself. They might have seen it differently. They might have thought he had grown colder, more detached, harder to reach. But what they could not see was the quiet boundary that had formed within him, a boundary not built from resistance, but from understanding. He was no longer reacting in the same way, no longer stepping into every space that called for him, no longer offering pieces of himself simply because there was an opening for them. And in that choice, something shifted permanently. It was not loud. There was no moment of declaration, no visible change that could be pointed to and named. Only a quiet turning inward, a gentle decision made once, and then again and again. Each time a moment like this appeared, to remain, to observe, to let things be, and slowly that choice began to shape him, not into someone distant, but into someone who no longer needed to prove his presence through constant response. Someone who understood that silence, when chosen with awareness, was not absence. It was power, held quietly, without the need to show itself. And in that power, he found something he had not realized he was searching for. A sense of self that did not move with every voice around him. A stillness that remained even when everything else continued to shift. And for the first time, that stillness felt enough. After that moment, something in him no longer reached outward in the same way. It was not that he withdrew from the world or turned away from others completely. He still listened. He still noticed. He still stood where he had always stood. But there was a quiet change in how he carried himself within it all. Before, there had been a subtle urgency inside him, a need to respond, to smooth over tension, to make sure nothing remained unsettled. Even in silence, there had been a kind of pressure, as if quiet was only a pause before he would eventually speak. Now, that pressure was gone. Silence was no longer something temporary. It had become a place he could rest. They continued as they always had. Their voices rose and fell, sometimes calm, sometimes calm, sometimes calm, sometimes careless, in ways they did not seem to notice. They spoke with the same expectations, the same quiet assumption that he would meet them where they stood. But he no longer felt pulled in the same direction. He could hear them without stepping into their rhythm. He could see the patterns without becoming part of them. And slowly, something else began to take shape within Hai. Maybe a kind of self-respect that did not need to be spoken. It did not ask for recognition. It did not wait for understanding. It simply existed, steady and quiet. Have you ever felt that kind of stillness? The kind that does not depend on what others say or how they see you. It is not something that arrives all at once. It grows in small moments, in quiet decisions, in the space between what is said and what is left unsaid. He began to notice that the less he reacted, the more he remained whole within himself. The less he tried to correct every misunderstanding, the less he felt the need to explain who he was. And in that, there was a kind of freedom. Not loud, not something that needed to be shared. Just a quiet release from something he had been carrying for a long time. They may not have understood it. They may have continued to see only the surface, the silence, the distance, the change they could not name. But he no longer needed them to understand, because what he had found did not depend on their view. It lived entirely within him, a calm that did not break under pressure, a presence that did not disappear in the absence of words, a strength that did not ask to be seen. And so he remained as he was, not reacting to every movement around him, not offering himself to every passing moment, just present, just aware, just still. And in that stillness, there was no struggle left, only a quiet knowing that he did not have to answer everything, that he did not have to be understood by everyone, that he could hold his silence without losing himself inside it. And somehow, in that quiet, he had rebuilt something that could not easily be shaken again. Not through force, not through resistance, but through the simple, steady choice to remain at peace within himself.